This morning we're still in Acts 16, obviously, and we are simply covering verses 11 to 15. So not a long lesson, but certainly an interesting one. So let me read, and then we'll commence from there. So Acts chapter 16, verses 11 to 15. So setting sail from Troas, we ran a straight course to Samothrace, and on the day following to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia, a Roman colony, and we were staying in this city for some days. And on the Sabbath day we went outside the gate to a riverside, where we were supposing that there would be a place for prayer. And sitting down, we began speaking to the women who had assembled. And a woman named Lydia, from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple fabrics, a worshipper of God, was listening, whose heart the Lord opened to pay attention to the things spoken by Paul. And when she and her household had been baptized, she urged us, saying, "If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come into my house and stay." And she prevailed upon us. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So, as I said, not a long lesson. It divides much more neatly if I cover this portion and then we move through the rest of the chapter from there. So just to remind, mainly you, who wasn't here last week, Paul's second missionary journey. They've backtracked through a number of places they went through on the first missionary journey, so Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, etc. They're forbidden from going through the Roman province of Asia, so Asia, the western end of Asia Minor, where, Ephesus, Pergamum, Thyatira, all those places, Philadelphia. They then try to go up into the Orontes, or up into basically the south of the Black Sea, on the Pontus, and they're denied there as well, so then they have to go around Asia. Once they get to Troas, the ancient port city of Troy, that's where Paul receives the Macedonian vision, and we're given this kind of enigmatic vision of who this individual is. It's just simply the description of the Macedonian man. Come over to us and help us, save us, literally rescue us. Many hypotheses, and this is what might interest you, given your ancestral background. Ultimately, there's no way of us determining what that vision looked like. We're just simply told that it obviously was an immediate connection with Macedonia for some reason. My preferred interpretation, which has some weight historically in terms of people who've preferred this historically, especially early church Eastern fathers, of the Hellenic variety, was that this Macedonian man was actually not in the literal sense, but it was a visage of Alexander the Great, by virtue of him being able to immediately identify this individual with Macedonia. Purely speculative. There's no way of us determining, but obviously he associated this individual with Macedonia and was able to recognize it kind of immediately. It would be like, the comparison I tried to give last week was, someone someone seeing a visage of the late Queen. They would immediately associate that with the United Kingdom, that kind of idea. Nevertheless, one other important thing just to note grammatically as well, if you have a look, mate, in verse, where are we? Sorry, I've got to go back up here. Yeah, verse 10, so that was the last verse we covered. Have a look up here in verse 10. And when he, as in referring to Paul, when he had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to proclaim the gospel to them. Mm-hmm. This is the first time in Acts that we get the inclusive, the second person plural, like we. And so what this is indicating is that Paul, Silas, Timothy in that cohort actually meet Luke, the author of Acts, in Troas. Mm-hmm. And so now Luke is actually with them, and is now he's not relying on other primary source evidence. He is the primary source, so he's now with them at this point. Make sense? Yeah.
That change that you just referred to, therefore, is significant.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. Which is what I highlighted last week, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, so he's actually with them on this point of the trip, all the way through Greece. So you'll see that as we keep running through. So let's begin in verse 11. Setting sail from Troas, we now, because Luke is with them, we ran a straight course to Samothrace and then on the following day to Neapolis. Samothrace, island in the North Aegean, historically not a highly developed island. It had originally been, if my memory serves me correctly, a colony settled by the island of Samos, which is off the coast of Asia Minor or West Turkey, hence the name Samothrace or Samos of Thracia. It didn't have a highly developed city there or anything, but it did have a very well-known temple cult to the Greek pantheon, so to the Greek gods, and so religious pilgrimage was common there. But it also primarily served as a port for travel across the North Aegean, basically. So they stop off at Samothrace to then basically connect to another ship sailing onto Neapolis, which is where they land. Then you have the map there. Where would I have kept those?
Can I make a point about that part of the world?
Yep.
One of the striking things is how barren the islands are, or can be.
Yeah.
And the pagans, the Greek pagans, whose main goddess, I think she was Aphrodite or one of those.
Yeah.
One of the pantheon. The remoteness of those islands would have encouraged isolation, meditation, escape from.
Hence the cult to the great gods on the island. Yeah.
So
it's a mountainous island too.
But it also, I think, attracted the escaping Jews from the Levant, from Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. We know that the oldest extant synagogue is outside of Jerusalem, is in Rhodes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, correct.
So this is not far from Rhodes. Samos is just a stone's throw from Rhodes, and Samothrace is a little further north.
Yeah.
And my view is that for the same reasons of remoteness and isolation, it would have also attracted the persecuted Jews.
That may very well have, yeah. I'd have to go and try and look at who, obviously, other than the cult of the great gods on the island. Yeah, you have. The Thassos at this time, which is right up in that same area near Samothrace. Thassos has a well-developed city in ancient Hellenic times. Thassos was also known for its Olympic victors. Had a very strong record there. But Samothrace itself.
It's interesting to me because I went through Berea.
Yep.
And I thought, there's nothing here.
Not terribly, no.
It's a tiny little village.
Yeah, certainly is.
So why would the Jews have gone to Berea? I'm sure there were Jews all up through Thessaly and all the way up to Thessalonica.
Yep.
And they were escaping because they were persecuted. They were persecuted in Jerusalem, they were persecuted in Egypt, they were persecuted wherever they were persecuted. They seem to have escaped to Greece.
Yeah.
And Rome.
And many of the Hellenistic places, the places that had... Yeah, there was a natural diaspora when Alexander the Great conquered basically the entire eastern portion of the world. And so there was a natural migration and diaspora through and as a result of that anyway. Either those who were fleeing the onslaught of the Macedonian army or those who just naturally migrated around the empire anyway. So that's why you end up having, by this point, you have Jewish communities all over the world at this point. Yeah. If you want...
it's a fascinating study on its own, actually.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's quite interesting, especially when you're studying, especially because it's occurring in the intertestamental period, so the period between the end of the Old Testament writing and then the beginning of the New Testament, where there's about 400 years where nothing is written, and that gets explained why it's intentional. But that period is when a lot of those things are kind of going on. If you want the map, if you look over on the board there, if you want one, there's a map on the left side. But anyway, it just shows you. Fortunately, you know the routes just as well as I do.
Well,
so
praise the Lord, I've actually been around that part of the world. So
yeah, same. So have I. So
I can visualise it.
Exactly. Yeah, it's good. And so anyway, so they head over to Neapolis, and so then they then arrive in port in Neapolis. And so now you're up in the orange area in the top left of your map, Macedonia, and that's the port city. That's the major port city for Philippi, ultimately. So. That's why, hence, in verse 12, it continues on. From there, from the port city of Neapolis, they travel to Philippi, which is a leading city of the district of Macedonia, a Roman colony, and we were staying in this city for some days. So, one thing that's interesting to point out, which just speaks to the greater providence of God, I suppose. When you arrive in a place like Neapolis in ancient times, under Rome, you would be then traveling on obviously you're traveling from Neapolis, and they point out that Philippi is the major leading city. It's essentially the de facto capital, or the seat, so it were, of the province of Macedonia. And you're traveling at that point, and this continues on when we work our way through the rest of the chapter. As they start heading down mainland Greece to eventually to Athens. This portion up here in Thrace, Macedonia, Elysium, is travelling on the Via Egnata, which was a major Roman road built back when the Romans conquered Macedonia. Back in, I believe they conquered Macedonia, if my memory serves me correctly, in 165 BC. And then they work their way down from there as they conquer all of Greece. And so the Via Egnatia was the major highway, the major Roman road that travelled, that connected Byzantium, i.e. Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, all the way across northern Greece, Macedonia, over to then to the Adriatic Sea, where you then cross over into the Italian peninsula. It was a major thoroughfare that everyone from Julius Caesar to Pompey the Great had marched their armies across as they conquered Greece. And this might seem like a menial point, but I don't think it really is. I think it's an interesting point. You now have the gospel and the message of Christ arriving in Europe for the first time with the Roman roads, so the roads of the empire, which for hundreds of years after this are going to continue to try and kill them all off and wipe them all out. And those roads are actually the very route, the means literally, by which the gospel actually spreads. Do you understand the point I'm trying to draw? The roads of the empire, which is trying to oppress these very men, is itself being used to actually spread that very message. The reason why they are safely able to travel from Troas via Samothrace to Neapolis without getting raided by Greek pirates is because Rome rules the seas. Right? The Roman navy constantly patrols the entire Mediterranean Sea, including all the other various seas like the Aegean, the Adriatic, etc., etc., etc. And so it's actually the protection and defense of the Roman navy that then allows the spread of a message which is ultimately going to bring that very empire to become Christian itself 300 years later. The kind of the cosmic irony of it is not lost on me. So nevertheless, let's continue on. So they come to Philippi. Now, I explained last week, and I'll just remind you. So Philippi, the city that was conquered and then kind of renamed by Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great, in the 4th century BC. It's it, along with Thessaloniki, to whom the letter to the Thessalonians is written, or those two letters, are the two most important cities in Macedonia. And Thessaloniki is in Macedonia, certainly at this time as a Roman province. You can see that on your map there. These two important cities kind of form the basis of this time in Macedonia, and a significant percentage of the time here on this trip is obviously spent here in Macedonia. More broadly, even in Greece, especially by the time you account them moving down into Achaia, which was just now the provincial name for basically southern Greece at this point, including places like Athens and then Corinth, where he spends 18 months, about a year and a half. And so he spent this whole trip. He's spending a lot of time. This is very much a deeply Hellenistic trip, so it were. And so being in Philippi, it's going from these major strategic or major cities of importance, one to the other, one to the other. So continuing in verse 13, here's what happens when they're in Philippi. On the Sabbath day, it's a Saturday, we went outside the gate to a riverside. And there we were supposing that there would be a place of prayer. And sitting down, we began to speak to the women who had assembled. So under not just Jewish custom, but Jewish law at this time, in order to actually have a synagogue or form a synagogue, you needed at least 10 men. And there were times, we were talking earlier about, Israelite communities that had spread out throughout the world at this point. At times, you wouldn't have enough. It would be a small, Hebrew population in that town or in that village or in that city or whatever the context happens to be. And you wouldn't actually have the numbers to actually be able to form according to Jewish custom at the time. And so you would have then not a synagogue, but basically a place of prayer, a place to conduct kind of synagogue activities light, so quasi-synagogue activities. And for one reason or another, we know that riversides were favoured. I haven't been able to find a particular reason why, but nevertheless they were favoured anyway. And so this was not uncommon by ancient standards 2,000 years ago, certainly not in this kind of context. And so it's a group of women, which kind of explains that thing. There's no other men there that are present.
There aren't any men.
Yeah, and so that explains. So that's how we can know that this is what this context is fitting. When you know what the custom was historically, you can then see why this story is playing out the way it is. So there's obviously not enough men or no men or either or, doesn't really matter. And so you just have a group of women who have assembled there for a place of prayer. So there's no formal, synagogue, right? Church service, you want to think of it that way, that's being conducted, and there can't be because of the custom of having at least 10 men.
It's an unusual setting, to say the least.
This here, yeah. It's unusual by any real standard.
Was Lydia a widow?
We're going to get onto that. Yeah, we'll get on. We'll work our way through because we can know things logically. Again, using context and using historical information. Yeah, using historical information, we can then get a pretty good grasp on who she was. So they sit down again by a riverside. There's a group of women there who have assembled for prayer in like manner, and ta-da, right? So they.
By the way,
yep.
Riverside is contrasted in my mind to mountaintops, where oracles of Greece normally preferred
Correct,
to be.
Yeah.
Actually, always preferred.
Always
to be.
preferred.
Always. Yeah. River. Who wants the river? It's lowlands. Let's go up to the tops of the mountains. Even on the islands, Delos, for example, there's no way. There's no river on Delos.
There's a river. Yeah.
They prefer isolated mountainous outcrops.
Yeah, hills and peaks. Yeah.
So this is interesting. This is by a river. It's lowlands. It's got nothing to do with oracles. It's probably got more to do with rivers of running. I'm
going to make a connection when we get through.
The water that comes out of the throne in the heavens.
That's one of the connections we're going to make when I get through.
It's a river.
Yeah, that's one of the connections we'll make. We'll get there because that's one of the connections.
A river of living water. That's what I wanted to say.
Correct. Yeah, that's a connection that I'm going to draw. So we'll work our way when we get through that. You'll see how that pieces together. So, what then happens? Okay, so they've gathered there. Verse 14, and a woman named Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple fabrics, a worshipper of God, was listening. We'll get to the second half of the verse in a minute. So this woman Lydia. Now, there's a couple of things to point out because once we get through the identity, once we get through who she is, etc., and the baptism, that's where we then get onto that point, you actually kind of provenance there about the setting, because that's how I'm tying it back into who she is and what the setting is. So Lydia is actually the region of, historically is the region of Asia. So if you have a look on your map, the red area, the province of Asia, that area plus the brown area, the Kia, the golden area, Pamphylia, even up to the north, Bithynia and Pontus, that whole region historically was the kingdom of Lydia. And that's the name of that broader region. It was a kingdom before it was eventually conquered by the Persian Empire in 546 BC. So what this is her name is actually the name of the region. So that happens at times in certain languages, but Lydia is the name of that region. Thyatira is in that region. You can see it there if you look in Asia. One of the seven, you got the 7 different yellow dots that they've highlighted there. So those are the 7. Those I highlighted because they were the 7 cities of Asia Minor to whom he writes. But up the north end, you've got Pergamum and then Thyatira, just next to the word Asia. So that's Thyatira. So that's where she's from originally. She's obviously living, is she living in Philippi or is she just there for business? We're not really told. The logical assumption is she now lives in Philippi. That's what probably makes most sense. But nonetheless, either way, she either lives there now or she's just there for an extended time doing business. One way or the other, doesn't really matter. But she's Lydia of Thyatira, which is interesting because it's a name, her personal name, Lydia, is also the name of the region and the kingdom, or the ancient kingdom. Sometimes that has caused some historians to speculate that perhaps she was either at one point or even at this point a slave, because it was not uncommon to refer to slaves or give, in terms of their personal name, as where they were from. That we know that happens a number of times, and so that's been a speculation. I don't think that fits with the context, and I don't think it works contextually with what we know about her. But nonetheless, she's from Thyatira. She's in Philippi, and then you're given a number of very select kind of characteristics about her in the span of about one sentence. She's a seller of purple fabrics. Now, Thyatira had a very well-known, well-developed textiles industry, essentially. Thyatira was famous for basically 2 things. One, its textile industry, and as well as its bronze manufacturing guild in ancient times.
By the way, Lydia is Jewish.
No.
Okay.
Well, let me get through the first part of it, and then once we get to the worshipper of God thing, we'll then work on it.
Okay.
We'll get there. So, because the business side plays in it too. So, purple fabric in the ancient world, for either if you're unaware, is expensive. Purple has always been expensive. It's produced from the glands, essentially the mucus of the murex snail. The Phoenicians were famous for it, and so if you look over, you can actually see Phoenicia if you look on the eastern side of your map, near just part of Syria near Abilene. Just on the coast, there's Phoenicia, the green area, the little strip down the bottom right-hand corner. You'll see this green strip, Phoenicia, and then you'll see cities like Ptolemy or Acca. You see up the top, Sidon, and then in the middle, Tyre. So Tyre was famous for its production of purple, and that's why purple in the ancient world was commonly known as Tyrian purple, otherwise known as royal or imperial purple. Very expensive, and was essentially a luxury. It was a very expensive luxury dye to be able to be used, and was often used by aristocrats and by the wealthy, and there was even a point in Roman history where it was actually exclusively reserved for the emperor himself.
The author of my Bible says that Lydia was Jewish, but let's assume that is so. Mm-hmm. The snail that you referred to, according to Levitical law, is an unclean beast, is it not? So if she were Jewish, she'd be working outside of the Levitical law.
Yeah. That's one of the evidences of her non-Jewishness. and working in that kind of manufacturing. It's the same as how, for example, when we encountered Simon the Tanner back in chapter 7. No, sorry, it must have been 10 with Cornelius. You have a man there in Caesarea Maritima, or just further south of Caesarea Maritima, the other city, where he's working as a tanner. So he's working with animal garments and tanning and producing hides. Dead beasts are completely off limits. And so that was an interesting part of that story. But yes, so this is working with a similar thing. So that's one of the things.
Are you saying that Simon the Tanner was not Jewish?
No, it's a different kettle of fish. We explained that he was. No, we explained that in that context that he is. I forget exactly what the exegetical point was that I made there. But no, I'm pretty sure I still concluded that he was Jewish in that. But it's that, in this context, it's that plus other details that lead us to the conclusion that she's Greek, not Jewish. So she's a businesswoman. She's also here, and this description comes up just later. She's the head of her household, and you're not going to get, so in terms of, you don't get the literal wording of she being head of her household, but the implication of her being brought back to the house. So like verse 15, her having the ability to say, "Come back to my house and say," means that she is the head of her household. So she is essentially matriarch thereof, legally and otherwise. There's a couple of things that are working here together. So she is clearly a businesswoman. She's also the head of her household. And what that does broadly is it indicates two things. One, she's a free woman with almost 100% certainty. So she's not a slave. It would be shockingly, I can't even think of a single instance in ancient Greco-Roman literature that someone would be able to be dealing in business in this sense so freely, but yeah, especially on luxury items like purple dye, and then being able to then kind of unilaterally invite someone back to my house. It's a gigantic stretch to think that she's a slave in this context.
It's not relevant for us. It's an interesting side issue.
Yeah, correct.
It is possible. I'm not saying it's probable. It is possible because one of the most prominent bankers at the time in this area, in this part of the world, was an ex-slave.
Correct, yeah, exactly. And the way slavery worked in the Roman Empire was, yes, you had, so all kinds of different categories of slaves. You had, obviously, 99% of gladiators are slaves. That's not, when we think of a gladiator, they were great warriors, but they were slaves. That's what that was. You were captured as a slave, or you were often, for many of them, born as a slave. You were born in the dominus, the household of your lord, and you were raised as a gladiator.
The slaves themselves didn't mind.
No, they didn't mind either. No, correct. No, a gladiatorial life was a tough life, but was often rewarded very well, for obvious reasons. And even yeah, exactly. The slavery had all kinds of
slaves we have in our society.
Yeah, correct. Yeah,
we're all slaves.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you've got people who are slaves to these things. You've got people who are enslaved to their banks, who can hardly get through life if they didn't have a bank funding, basically bankrolling their life. Yeah, yeah, correct. Yeah.
I mean, when I say get over it, I mean to the people, to the
no,
world
I know
out
contextually
there.
What you mean. Yeah.
The world out there detests slavery. They don't even know anything about slavery.
No, correct. Yeah, yeah. Slavery comes in many different forms and varieties. We often think of the kind of the obvious kind of brutal end of chattel slavery, coming from that French word for cattle. So that's vis-a-vis kind of antebellum American South Democrat slavery, like in the field.
Even cotton field slavery in the deep South of the USA was multifaceted.
Correct, and that's what I was about to say. Yeah, and even that was the next sentence. Even in that context. What that looked like, and none of this is like, oh yes, no, this is a brilliant, good thing. We should bring that back. No. It's just explaining historical reality. That history is often far more complex than the average punter is actually willing to bother to study. But nonetheless, so here's the basic position. Lydia is with extremely high probability a free woman and a widow. She clearly has legal standing in regard to both business and property ownership. And the only genuine way that you come about that is through your husband having then passed away, and obviously then you inheriting that and then being the leader of the household in that sense. So she's a free woman. She is a property owner. She runs her household. She is a businesswoman, and she's there with her household. Now, the household, whether the household is the group of women or whether she is one of the women among the group of women, and then the household is something separate, that's not context. Sometimes that gets automatically assumed, but it's actually not really there in the text. So at the end of verse 13, when we began speaking to the women who had assembled, that should not automatically be assumed to be the household that's in view. That she could just be among a group of other women that she knows, right? So either way, we'll get onto that when we get to verse 15 a bit further. So she's named Lydia, from Thyatira, now in Philippi, seller of purple fabrics, expensive luxury goods, businesswoman, and a worshipper of God. Now, this is the same designator that is given to Cornelius the centurion back in chapter 10. So Cornelius is the first Gentile convert of note that occurs, and that's why his basically the entire chapter that's dedicated to his story in Acts chapter 10 is there. And we explained that when we went back, but just to give you the summary or to recap on what that was, he is a centurion, so he's a military commander. He's been a Roman soldier for at least 10 years. He's in command of the Italica cohort, which was a cohort's about 500 troops. He's part of the Italica cohort, so they are ethnically Italian, so they're like Romans in Caesarea Maritima, which is, you can also see there on your map as well. Go down to the bottom right corner, you've got Jerusalem, and if you follow the red line up, you'll see Caesarea Maritima. So that's a major important city, and that was basically the Roman capital, functionally speaking at least, of at this time in history. It's actually in Judea, but nonetheless, he is described as a worshipper of God, or as a God-fearer. It's the same kind of concept. And so that's not someone who is ethnically Jewish. They're ethnically something else, a Gentile in this case. His case, Italian or Roman, but who is following the Israelite customs, like the things we find in the Old Testament. He honors and worships Yahweh, the God of the Bible, but is not like a full-blown convert into the Old Covenant, into the covenant community, and so isn't circumcised, for example, etc., etc., etc.
It's a fascinating separate study about how such a man, and there were many of those men and women, how they came to this station in life of following Jewish religious ideas, customs, perhaps even attending synagogue, being in the back row, kind of listening,
outside usually, often
looking, observing intently, wondering what this is all about.
Yeah. Well, exactly. Basically, that's what it is. Basically, yeah, it's someone who's in the orbit. So they're in the orbit of God, if you want to think of it that way. They actually would have been outside the synagogue. They would have been outside the synagogue. Only those who had been ritually brought into the covenant through circumcision were allowed in. So that's why, like the Ethiopian eunuch in chapter 7.
Yeah, but he was a eunuch.
No, but it's the same concept. So he as a eunuch there was a 0% chance he ever would have been let in. But that's the whole part of the story, because the Jews wouldn't let him into the synagogue, but he's welcomed fully and openly into the Christian community. Yeah, that's the contrast. But
it's a fascinating study.
Yeah, correct.
We're not told. I mean, really, you have to immerse yourself as a reader into the words of this account and wonder, how did this Roman, well-paid, hierarchically minded man
a warrior, a dedicated, yeah, and still be doing, and still be, I mean, he's not
in charge of many men.
He's in charge of at least 80 to 90 men. centuries were often, ironically, not 100. It
And
depends
he
on the
would have
name,
been
but yeah.
praying. He would have been a prayer, so he morning,
That's
noon
the big
and
part
night,
of it, yeah.
presumably. He would have been addressing his life circumstances to the Lord and saying, Lord, thank you for these 80 men that I've got under
Correct.
me. Help me to be a better leader, a better
Yeah.
example to them.
Yeah.
I mean, these are things that are very relevant to a Christian life.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's what what that is ultimately is what we call, and it comes up here, which is the point we're now moving on to, is the way in which God draws people to Himself. People find themselves kind of, brought into the orbit of God, and then eventually closer and closer and closer. So she's described as a worshiper of God. She was listening, as in listening to Paul, etc., talk. And she's then described as in referring to Lydia, whose heart the Lord opened to pay attention to the things spoken by Paul. This is just one of a never-ending list of language which is exactly the same, of God opening Lydia's heart, right, or opening the listener's heart. They're listening, but it's God who actually brings understanding. It's God who brings wisdom. It's God who brings knowledge. And it's God who needs to open the heart of people to then be able to understand and to receive Him. This is the exact same type of language you find replete and plenary throughout the entire scriptures. It's the exact same language, where He has been drawing her already into a base understanding of who God is, and then He opens her heart to be able to understand. Again, it's using a figure of speech because it's like, yes, the writers are aware and they understand that the heart at this time in history is understood to be, figuratively or otherwise, as basically the seat of one's mind and one's soul, so it were. It's why even ancient saints, we still use it with things like this today. When we are emotionally hurt by someone, I felt a knot in my stomach, type of thing. The gut or the stomach was thought to be the seat of emotions and et cetera, et cetera. That's why you get this kind of rhetoric. But nonetheless, the point being here is that it's God who opens her heart to be able to understand and pay attention to the things that Paul's saying. And he would have been teaching from what was the Bible at that point, right? What we would call the Old Testament. And he would be teaching about Jesus, and he would be showing, here's how the Old Testament has been saying for thousands of years now, this is who the Messiah is, and here's what Jesus did, and see how he perfectly matches up with da-da-da-da-da. And he opens her heart to be able to pay attention, to understand these things. And so then, in verse 15, when she and her household had been baptized, now this is I think this is the second instance we've encountered, or is it the third? No, it must be the second. This is the second instance we've encountered thus far of a household baptism. So the same thing with Cornelius. When Cornelius converts, he and his entire household are then baptized, and there's two things going on there that have been up for debate in terms of interpretation, admittedly. The main point driving, though, is that, and this is what I wanted to really connect. Back when we did Acts chapter 10, I said when we keep going through, when we encounter the other household baptisms, I'll try and thread the needle to show the connection. But God does not just merely work through these kind of isolated individualistic means. Old Testament and New Testament, so Old Covenant and New Covenant, He is not operating kind of on the basis of, I'm trying to save this one singular individual. All throughout the Old Covenant, He's working through a nation, right? He's working through the descendants of Abraham. So it comes through one man. It begins with someone. It begins with Abraham. But it's through him that all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So it's through his descendants, the 12 tribes, of whom there is a patriarch of each tribe, so like an ancestral leader, and all the way down, Even in the New Testament, that doesn't change. Now, it's a common Baptist misunderstanding, unfortunately, admittedly, where we become too focused, and it's not a historical thing, it's really kind of a pretty modern thing, where we become very focused on, are you individual human being? have you been saved, is the kind of rhetoric that gets thrown out there. It's kind of like punching a ticket to heaven. It just doesn't make, A, it doesn't make sense, and B, more importantly, it's not biblical. It's not biblical.
It's not biblical.
It's not biblical at all, yeah. Is that God works generationally, he works familially, and because the individual, I've explained this before, in fact I did even recently back in chapter 1 of Deuteronomy in our sermon series, where Moses was instituting the hierarchical leadership structure of the nation of Israel. The lowest denominator was leaders of 10. Well, that's the family. On average, in the ancient world, the Israelite family was obviously 2 parents and 8 kids. That's the average. And so your 10, that changes at different times. But long story short, 10 is the family unit, right? As far as the Bible and as far as Christian understanding is concerned, the individual is not the base unit of society. The family is. It's not the nation. The nation isn't the base family. So we reject communism, we reject fascism, we reject all of these godless ideologies that basically destroy the family, destroy community, and just flatten everyone out, and so that we're all just like little beans in a bean bag that can be shaped and remolded however the tyrant wants it to be.
By the way, representational democracy is also rejected by the Bible.
Correct. Don't get me started on that. Because I agree.
The family is the unit. It raises some very interesting things, which I'm sure you'll cover, about Lydia was listening. Mm-hmm. She wasn't preaching.
No, yeah, she's listening to Paul. Yeah, correct. Yeah, no, sometimes that needs to be repeated, yeah.
However, there's a balance. God's balance is amazing. Mm. We're told, Scripture tells us that the man is the spiritual head of the woman and the spiritual head of the household.
Yep, father to mother, and
but here we
the
have
family.
Lydia being the spiritual head of her household.
Yeah.
Why? Because there's no man.
There's no man. She's a widow. Yeah, exactly. And so that's exactly right, because that's the point they're coming. You're right. That is one of the next points I'm making. But I'll jump to it now.
It's pretty easy, ladies and gentlemen.
It's not difficult. Yeah, correct. Yeah, exactly. It's not. And I'll bump. It was one of my later points, but I'll bump up the line thing as you mentioned it. Is that this is one of many examples that demonstrate that the Christian ethic, especially concerning family, and God's own instructions about the way that he has created families and ordered families, is not oppressive to anyone, least of all women. It's not misogynistic, it's not anti-woman, it's not keeping the woman in the kitchen doing that stupid thing while the man goes out and does the real thing. That's a complete trope and doesn't exist. What you do have, however, is a natural balance of order as opposed to chaos. You have structure as opposed to anarchy. You have hierarchy as opposed to just everyone running around and doing whatever they think is right in their own eyes. Here in this instance, you have Lydia, who is the head of her household by virtue of her obviously having been widowed. We know, and that's not speculation, that we know exactly how ancient Greco-Roman culture worked. And not just even Israelite culture. Greco-Roman culture was the same. You was no such thing as a woman who was the head of her household just in isolation. You were widowed, right?
But
that's how
here we're primarily concerned about the spiritual head of the household.
Exactly.
Lydia is the spiritual head of her household.
Correct.
Because her household gets baptized.
On account of her.
On her authority.
Correct, yeah. Exactly, and that's the comparative point that I'm trying to make with Cornelius. Cornelius is head of his household, he's the father, and God has given that responsibility to the father. Now with responsibility also comes duty, also comes obligation, also comes responsibility in that literal sense. The responsibility of bearing the consequences of when things go well and when things go wrong. And that is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. That is a good thing. We as people need leadership. We as people need guidance. We as people need order. We command it. Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Children demand parameters from their parents.
Correct. Yeah, even when they rebel against it and think that they don't need it. They find out right quickly they do. Yeah, correct. And so here in this case, exactly, yes. Lydia, by virtue of obviously having been widowed, is therefore also now matriarch of that household. She is now the spiritual head of that household. And so her household, now household in this context, again, important to understand what that means. We explained it back in chapter 10 when we looked at Cornelius. The same thing would be present here. By virtue of her being a business owner, she for sure, with 100% certainty, had slaves. But again, that's not an uncommon thing. And when we think of slavery in this context, we have to have the objectivity to analyze what that actually looks like. Slaves doesn't mean that she has a bunch of Africans chained up in a cupboard somewhere. In this context, her slaves are also Greek, and they live very well, and they're very well looked after, and they love her. Not because of some Stockholm syndrome, but because actually, no, she treats them as family, because you were considered part of the family. You were not obviously considered in like the literal, like literally you are my literal sister. But you were part of the household, and you were treated with great care, right?
Wives, servants.
Exactly. Yeah. Are they like servants? Is that what you're asking, basically? Or?
Very much.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And so they were exactly, and so there were plenty of instances where, if a slave in the literal sense, doulos, which is the Greek word, and they would have their own family. So they have their own, as in like their own little nuclear family, their own wife, their own children, as part of the broader household. If they were wanting to move or go somewhere or go on to do something, we have obviously didn't happen all the time, but we have historical records of that happening with the full blessing of the dominos, right, the lord of the household. Or the domina in this case, the female lord of the household, and so it's an understanding, of what that looks like. I mean, even if you go to the capital, if you go to Rome itself at this time, lawyers and doctors, there are slaves who are lawyers and doctors, right? So it's not that. So it's an understanding of what
Nothing has changed.
Well, not after the recent rubbish that physicians and doctors of various kinds were put through over the last couple of years.
Dr. Lawyer.
No, I know, exactly. Exactly. Dr. Lawyer that's sitting right here in the room.
That's so funny.
Yeah, correct.
So funny.
Yeah, Dr. Lawyer. Exactly. And yeah, correct. Good point. And so yeah, so it's doctors and lawyers and other such professions which have always been esteemed and were esteemed even in Roman times, were often slaves. Like that's how it worked. It's just an understanding of the fact that slavery has always been a spectrum. The brutal, barbaric forms down this end, all the way up to things that we would, if you travelled back in time, you wouldn't even immediately recognise that they were a slave until you like literally found out. And so her household includes not just any actual blood relative like family members, but it includes everyone as part of the household, including slaves that she 100% had. She ran a business, that means she had slaves. And so her household is then baptized on account of her, just like it was with Cornelius. This conclusion was drawn back then in chapter 10 as well. Cornelius' household, his family, wife, kids, etc., are all baptized. The slaves, which he had, also baptized. The presumption as well is that he also has a guard. As a centurion, he has a guard, and he's able to send and command soldiers. So when he wants to go and get Peter, who's down in, I forget where he was.
Joppa.
That's right, yeah, it was down in Joppa. So down south about, I think about 3 days ride, back return. He sends down a group of soldiers to go and ask for Peter to come up to Caesarea Maritima. Those guys are his guard. They're part of his household in that sense. They would have been among that group. Because it has to do with the way that God works. When you have in the very beginning of this book in Acts chapters 1 and 2, the day of Pentecost, where the church kind of formally begins, so it were, you have 3,000 men saved. Now, those men just weren't just this men's conference just for some reason gathered in Jerusalem. No, they're with their family, their husbands, with their fathers, they're with their families. So it's really not just 3,000. It's using the fathers as a quick way of being able to count that number. But it's 3,000 most of whom would have been fathers, majority you would imagine, would have been fathers and husbands, therefore.
Of multiple children.
Of many, many children. They have their wife, they have their children. So it's a huge number on the first day like that. But God doesn't work through, he's not concerned with just saving and bringing into relationship with himself this one singular person like me. No, he works through families, which means by definition, when you're working through a bunch of families, you're working through communities. You're therefore working through nations. That's how God spreads his kingdom and brings the message of salvation in Jesus Christ to the nations. And so then you eventually work your way through, and that's exactly the way it's worked. Some of the biggest changes in the course of history over the last 2,000 years have been when a king of a kingdom has converted. The entire Roman Empire changed when Constantine, the emperor in the early 3rd century, because Rome had multiple emperors at this point, but the one who eventually won out and defeated his enemy at the Battle of Milvian Bridge. Constantine, as emperor in the early 4th century, the early 300s, converts to Christianity, and the entire makeup of the Roman Empire now changes. He legalizes Christianity. So in other words, he ends formal persecutions. Christianity is now legal to practice. They're no longer going to be hunted and outlawed and everything else. And then his successive emperors after him, especially Theodosius the Great, in the late 4th century, then actually makes Christianity the state religion. Because of course it would be, because the emperors are now Christians. That was a necessary thing that occurred. Sometimes Protestants look back on that as a bad thing. It's just a bad understanding of history. It's Rome repenting of the very essence of the imperial cult and emperor worship and everything, all the state gods which were tied to the Roman Empire as a state. That occurs all the time. The conversion of Clovis I around the year 500, who was king of the Franks. The Franks were part Germanic paganism, but mostly Arianism, which was this heretical philosophy that basically viewed Jesus as divine, but as like the first creature that God ever made, which is not at all what this says. He converts to Christianity, and the Franks then become Christian because the king is the father of the nation. Clovis, C-L-O-V-I-S, Clovis I. He's king of the Franks, who are the ancestors of the French. That's where that name comes from. Around the year 500 AD. And so his conversion marks a big change in the history of Western Europe, where Christianity it was already in Western Europe. It was already in Gaul, which is where France is. It was already in Britannia, so Britain. It arrived there in the 1st century. But in terms of Western continental Europe, the conversion of Clovis I to Christianity, obviously now he then governs and rules as a Christian king, Christian laws, builds churches, right, blah, blah, blah. And so that changes the entire makeup, because what that is it's the same principle, except that's God working through the father of the nation, which is what monarchs are. That's why you have royal families, because it's the family that's the head of the nation, of the people, and there's a unity, and you work through generation. So, my ancestors are known to have been Christian for at least 1,100 years, and beyond that, it kind of lingers off into the realm of not necessarily legend, but more
Celtic paganism.
Well, eventually you go back far enough and you get to Celtic paganism. Yeah.
I'm not having a go at it because mine were Greek pagans.
Greek pagans, yeah. You eventually go back far enough and you would get back to Celtic paganism for my ancestors, obviously. My ancestral line is known back to the late 9th century, and then beyond that is more by claimed descent. But either way, that at a basic level, my singular little bloodline has been Christian for 1,000 years. Right. But that's not like some special case at all. Anyone with specifically, I'll use a broad category, British descent, So Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, or anything else in between, Norman, etc. Their ancestors have been Christian for centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries because Britain has been, the Celts have been Christian broadly for 1800 to 2000 years, and then the Anglo-Saxons who arrive later on are then converted, around the year 600 and following. So then they've been Christian for, broadly speaking, about 1300 years.
The Angles held out for quite
a while. The Saxons converted pretty quickly. The Saxons arrived. Yeah, the Angles and Saxons.
The Picts up north are another kettle of fish.
Well, they're
entirely.
a whole different kettle of fish entirely. Yeah, the Scottish have always had a very stalwart, rebellious spirit, haven't they? And their predecessors in that region, the Picts, are no exception. Yeah, good point. But nonetheless, the point I'm trying to draw is that is standard for how this works. God works through families that then build up with clans, tribes, communities, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how God is redeeming the nation. That's how he's bringing the people of the world back to himself. Not just this one little individual, me, punching my ticket to the proverbial pearly gates. And we've devolved that in a lot of evangelicalism down to that simple little axiom, and it's just completely, it's just wrong, it's not biblically accurate, but it's demonstrating really clearly how much a significant percentage of evangelical Christians have allowed those Enlightenment ideas of rabid individualism to seep into the way they think about the world and God and the church and everything else.
And this account is a good reminder that Lydia took the spiritual health of all the individuals in her under her authority.
Seriously.
She took their spiritual health very, very seriously.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, exactly. And it comes down to authority. And it comes down to responsibility. It comes down to duty. It comes down to the way God has ordered the world. It's hierarchical because, and we explained this in those sermons, right? Hierarchy is inherently good. People at the various levels of a hierarchical structure are meant to operate righteously. They're meant to operate justly, and when that happens, things work well. Right?
She would have had to convince them.
In many respects. There's certainly the element of obviously, of explanation. How many of the household were here listening to Paul? We're not, again, we're just simply told it shouldn't be assumed that that's the group of women, but she would have then, some of them may have heard Paul kind of literally there and then. Many of them you would assume, if they're not there, obviously then she is then proclaiming exactly what Paul had said, and then she's then teaching the same thing to them. And so there's definitely that element. And it's all working within the reality of her being the matriarch of that household, essentially, of her being the both the legal and spiritual head of that household in that sense, and so it's not this little isolated individual. There's actually the whole confluence of order and of family and of hierarchy and all those things which modern Western man is trying to kind of rail against.
We've ditched what this represents. She was the genetic head of the household, being the eldest.
Yep, definitely.
And the mother of the children, including the male children.
Correct, yep.
You would assume she had male children.
Yeah, for sure, yeah.
And female children. So she was the genetic head. She was the authoritative head. Mm-hmm. So in terms of discipline, in terms of structure, she was the economic head.
Yep.
And importantly for this account, she was the spiritual head. So in those days, and even for our, say, grandparents' generation, everyone looked to the head of the household for leadership, for all sorts of leadership, for cues on how to live life properly, on how to live life in an orderly manner, in a spiritually orderly manner, in a just moral manner. Once upon a time, we looked to leadership. Now we seem to have ditched all of that.
Yeah,
nearly all of it.
Yeah, well, and then it ends up becoming a kind of almost like a quote unquote self-fulfilling prophecy, so it were, because the worst possible cultural context for that to occur in is democracy. You mentioned, democracy earlier in that context in the biblical sense, because what you end up getting is, whilst one can rightfully identify ills and wrongships and evils in political leadership, at the end of the day, you voted for them, you put them there, right? And so when you end up, and so the leaders are the leaders in that sense are in the purest form a reflection of the citizenry, right? And so as this destabilizes among the citizenry, that ends up getting reflected in the politics. The politics are downstream from the cultural shift, especially, not exclusively, but especially in a democratic, or Republican, or same thing in that context, a democratic/Republican setting. Whereas that doesn't always happen in other contexts. So, like if you go back to, a number of different medieval contexts, obviously operating in a more intentional monarchical setting, there are things that go wrong among the populace that don't, but the king is still able to maintain order and law and civility, even though there's this problem going on down here. Now, things don't go well when you have an evil king, a wicked ruler, an unrighteous king. But then again, the idea that we're going to stand here in the 21st century with our current political state in the West and look down our nose at an unrighteous king from 800 years ago, as if this isn't like orders of magnitude worse, because it's not just, because at least with one king, and I'm showing my monarchist preference here, but at least with the singular monarch, not literally all, but what I'm primarily focused on is the conversion and the righteousness and the morality of that guy, not with the morality and the righteousness of an entire parliament of 300 people. Because now I'm concerned, who none of whom are responsible, because everyone can just point the finger at everyone else and who's supposed to be responsible.
Isn't it interesting, even with the number of anti-monarchy, rabid haters of the system, no one of those, not one single one in the period of Queen Elizabeth II's life dared pull her down in the press, in public. Everyone had respect for her. It doesn't matter what colour of politics they had.
Oh, correct.
Everyone looked to her and acknowledged her devotion to the crown.
Yeah,
Isn't that fascinating?
And to the nation, yeah. Because there was nothing, exactly, and look, people have mixed opinions on specific efficacies of how well, but that's a different question altogether in terms of like, well, how well did she rule? That's a different question. But the actual base fundamental kind of viewpoint of the embodiment of what a monarch should be in terms of character, conduct, et cetera, couldn't be questioned. And when I say couldn't be questioned, I don't mean like you were silenced. I mean you had nothing. What was it? What ill were you going to actually identify? What was this thing that you were going to go, oh, yep, no, this is the time where we got to boot the monarchy that's been around for, going back to Alfred the Great 1,200 years ago. You couldn't find anything, right? So you're 100% correct. Yeah, there was a baseline respect because of what she did embody. And one can only hope that her successors embody that too. We'll have to wait and see. But nonetheless, the point drawing is that the unfortunate side in a democratic sense is that when you flatten out leadership to having a plurality of, in this case, like hundreds of people, no one has to take responsibility, even though we all know that clearly this is the group that are making these decisions, but then you flattened it out to the point where you watered down the actual responsibility of each individual parliamentarian to the point where no one's actually responsible. You're just part of. Everyone can just point the finger towards everyone.
Well,
everyone else. Oh, it's this department. Oh, well, why? But why have you made this decision? Well, you need to speak to the secretary of blah blah, and speak to the minister for da da da.
It used to work, and it worked very well, and it worked particularly well in the Westminster parliamentary system, and it worked particularly well at the time of William Wilberforce, because generally speaking, all parliamentarians at Westminster were God-fearers, generally speaking.
But even at a base level, yeah, even if they weren't, even if they weren't terribly devoted to the Christian faith and to the Christian discipline, there was a baseline respect, and they had a baseline fear, i.e., respect, in other words,
Yep.
for God and for His institution. Yeah.
When in the last 2 generations in our country, we have not only watered down Christianity, but we've allowed ourselves to be disproportionately, if I can use that word, respectful to the other religions that we've allowed into the country since, say, the 60s migration explosion.
Definitely since 60s, 70s.
And I'm not pointing a finger at that respect. All I'm saying is that out of well-meaningness and consideration for other human beings, we have found ourselves in a position where we don't want to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ for fear of offending.
Yeah, and then all that's done at a broader level is, well, it's a failure to understand how nationhood works. You end up it's a failure to well, it's also it's a very atheistic understanding of how the world works, a secular understanding. It's built on the premise that you can have a whole host of completely different, like radically different worldviews, right? Understandings of how the world works, what the world is, what people are, what our purpose is, etc., kind of cohabitating and coexisting, even while standing in complete philosophical and theological contradiction to each other, and that A, that's all going to work out, and B, more importantly, you can somehow maintain social cohesion, and C, that you can actually continue to flourish or prosper as a nation when you have completely polar opposite understandings of what human beings even are, right? And you're seeing the consequence of that now, where wind your way down and we can't even tell you what a woman is anymore.
You're seeing the consequences of it religiously in a country like France. It is
Perfect
already torn apart.
Yeah, and that's, yeah, well, I mean, that's the French paying for bad decision after bad decision for the span of about 230 years now, because we're now in the Fifth French Republic, and they've had 5 republics, they've had 2 kingdoms and 2 empires. And
it's a failure. Their system presently is so not working.
Correct.
The country is almost burning.
Yeah, exactly. And what you see on the news is, this is actually ironically one of the cases where on the news is actually underselling it as opposed to its usual hyperbolic overselling of things. Because for anyone who knows much about France and especially Paris, it's actually even more deeply fractured than what you even see going on to the right at the moment. But my sympathy for the French, God bless them, is as close as zero as it can probably get, because this is the consequences. They've
done it.
No matter what, and don't get me wrong, it's not difficult to find legitimate gripes, say it were, with some of the latter rulers of the Capetian dynasty, so Louis XV, Louis XVI particularly. By the time you get to the 1700s, there was a level of decadence that existed in the French monarchy at that time, and in much of the French aristocracy. But the reality is that your solution to that, France, was to have an extremely violent and barbaric revolution where you murdered tens of thousands of people. And you tried that for about 10 years and realized that it was an absolute dumpster fire. And then you ended up realizing the need for a national unifying leader, because that's what human beings desire, because that's how God has ordered the world.
And you
ditch God, and then you get rid of the monarchy only to end up with an emperor in Napoleon, And then fast forward over the last 230 years, you've had, as I said, you've had 5 republics, you've had 2 kingdoms and 2 empires.
And
Prior to that, you had a kingdom for literally 800 years.
And a failed policy of colonisation compared to the British policy of colonisation, with all
correct.
its faults.
Yeah.
But at least the Brits.
But the net value of
the gospel of Jesus
correct.
Christ.
The net value of the British Empire is very clearly in the positive. The idea that people, it's demanding a level of perfection that the accuser themselves doesn't even have. But yeah, not all empires are created equal. The French policy was far more, let's just call it exploitative. But the point that's really being drawn here is that the way in which, and this speaks to the kind of ending point here about Lydia, as head and as spiritual head, legal head of her household, as the matriarch of that household. When you eliminate, as we are doing and have been doing for, at least on a concerted level, about 100 years now in the West, which is the deconstruction of the family as a unit, slowly and surely but progressively, it only reaps bad and destructive consequences, because you're ultimately destroying the foundational building block of the society. Families build clans, build tribes, build communities, build regions, cities, states, nations, kingdoms, right? It all you can't knock out and completely restructure the foundation of a building without collapsing the building. That's just how it works. And even through ways which we typically have come to try and value, but without actually perhaps thinking about the broader context. So, for example, the common complete historical misconception is that prior to universal suffrage, so universal voting rights, you had a system where only men voted because screw women and they're too dumb to do politics. It's not even remotely close to being historically true. And any serious historian, or any historian at any level, will tell you that that's not true. Like, it's verifiably not true. You didn't have only men could vote. You had one household can vote. One household can vote. If it's a widow, they don't lose their vote. One household could vote because of the premise that the foundational unit of society and civilization is the family. It's not the individual. Right? So what you end up having when you implement universal suffrage about 100 years ago on average in the West, or in that ballpark, kind of late 1800s, early 1900s, is you end up with a system where even just in one household, to keep it at the same level, the husband and the wife are both voting, and if they're voting together, which you would like to think, because you'd like to think that the husband and wife have a same view of life and what they value, well,
Maybe.
if they're in the ideal setting, if they're both voting in the exact same fashion, well, their vote's redundant. They're both voting the same. It's not why we have a second. So all you're doing is putting in a second vote. Or if their voting is contrary, so the husband votes one way, the wife votes the other, well, you've got a bigger problem on your you've got a much bigger problem on your hand, because politics is about what you think the nation should be, how you think things should be run, who you think should be leading. All this it's not like they're small questions, right? They're big questions, and so you end up having a situation where it's aiding in driving a wedge between the mother and the father of the household, as if that's a good. It's not as if that's a good thing, and it's not. All these kinds of things that we could go on forever with things that are like that, that only aid and contribute to the deconstruction of the family as the vital component of the nation, of the kingdom, of your civilization. And this kind of text does a whole bunch of things, but one of those things is the kind of the big point that we've talked about today, which has been the value of the household, right, of the family, and of the rightful and good, not just rightful in the sense of ontologically that this is a good thing, but that teleologically this is a good thing. That this is not just right, but also it's actually good. It's conducive to human flourishing. It produces benefit, not harm. That here in this case, Lydia, as matriarch of her household, as leader of her household, legally, authoritatively, spiritually, etc., is a good thing, and that God has designed the world not as this nice, flat, communistic utopia, as so envisioned over the last kind of 150 years, but is rather actually built hierarchically and therefore is ordered. Our ancestors, from Europe never, understood that well. The difference is they had the humility to not be envious of those above them. And those who were above had the humility to recognize that their inferiors, quote unquote, were not lesser human beings. And that they were actually, in many respects, actually utterly dependent on them. They were dependent on them for their good farming, for their good craftsmanship, and society actually worked because people weren't en masse, weren't envious of each other.
It's a very interesting point. It's a study in itself. One could look at the educational system today versus 50 years ago and see that all those elements that you've just mentioned are absent today. When I was a kid when we were looking to get our car in the 70s, family car, unless you were a doctor or a lawyer or similar, there's no way you would have shopped for a Jaguar or a Mercedes-Benz. No way. My dad was a tradesman. There's no way he would have envisaged himself as owning such a car.
And wouldn't have been upset by not having.
There's no way. There was a station in life.
Yeah, correct, yeah.
And people in Sydney and Melbourne generally stuck to that. And they stuck to it because they wanted to stick to it.
Yeah, because
there's no way you could have turned up to your mate's barbecue driving a Jaguar. You would have been pilloried. So we ended up getting a Holden Kingswood, and that was wonderful. And then when my dad educated my brother and myself, we were then given an open door, if I can put it that way, to then move away from Dad's station in life and go to a different station in life. That was the way one individual progressed through society in those days. The big difference 50 years later is that not only does a tradie look to purchasing a Jaguar or a Mercedes or a 3 Series Beamer or whatever, it's that they expect to own such a possession.
Correct. Yeah. Exactly.
That's a huge difference between 2023 and 1973. Huge difference.
And and even the 73, you could go back 50 years prior to that. You'd be able to see the progression. Yeah, but you're 100% correct even in that time frame. Yeah. So 100%. My Generation Z, my generation, those born kind of like late 90s, through the 2000s kind of thing. There is a baseline expectation because of the way, and it's broadly because of the way that we've been raised, but we're still 100% responsible, obviously. There's a baseline expectation that I complete high school, I go to university, I do my 3 or 4 year degree, whatever it happens to be, and then I come out and I'm going to tap dance my way into a $60,000 to $70,000 a year job, and I'm going to have designer clothing of some variety. I'm going to have all the technologies. I'm going to be able to waltz into a really, really nice apartment or home or whatever it happens to be, even in a renting setting. I'm going to have
expensive holidays.
I'm going to have the trips to Europe. I'm going to have the trips to Europe. I'm going to have the trips to the Pacific Islands. I'm going on a holiday. I'm going to pop over to America and go on a party here, party there, club this, casino that, I'm going to order takeout 3-4 times a week. I'm going to party on the weekends. I'm going to have this nice car that's going to be at least, 40, 50, 60 plus thousand. It's just a baseline expect, because all of that ultimately is driven by envy. It's driven by envy. It's driven by seeing X, Y, and Z and going, yeah. Not only do I want that, I deserve it. I deserve it, right?
Biblically, of course. Biblically, it talks to individualism rather than, shall we say, non-individualism, and it speaks to pride.
All the time, yeah.
Pride.
Yeah, and it always ties back to pride. That's why pride. I mean, pride is the arch sin. It's the sin that begets all sins. Most things that people do wrong, and most of the wrongful, sinful inclinations of one's own thinking and one's actions can ultimately be traced back to pride. And envy is no exception, because envy comes from exactly like, if you go back, I used it earlier, so I might as well use it again. Again, the common historical misunderstanding about how society worked, through the kind of particularly the high and late medieval period, even into the early modern period of 1500 to 1700, that basically you were, let's just say your father was a blacksmith, speaking of random occupation, or a farmer's even a good one example is a farmer, and his father was a farmer before him who was a farmer, and you've had the farm in your family for 100 years or plus, that basically you were condemned, that your bloodline was eternally condemned to just be farmers. That's not how it worked at all. If your father wanted you to become, I'm just going to use the blacksmith as the example, he would then go to the blacksmith in the village or in the town, and you would then work for him, and you would get trained up as a blacksmith. And now, congratulations, you have the skills of a blacksmith, and now you can become a blacksmith. That happened all the time. Even progression more hierarchically up into the lower nobility happened, right? Your average knight we often think of as being a part of nobility, and on a technical sense they were, because you had hereditary knighthood. But people forget the fact that knights were servants. I mean, the word knight, nicht, from etymologically going back into Old English, means servant, literally means servant. And so knights were servants of their feudal lords, but knights would often progress up through the ranks, through their victories in battle, through their successful military campaigns, different achievements, having defended the realm or defended the lord, etc., what it was. And you had progression all the time. But the difference is that the farmer, going back to him, the farmer wasn't sitting around all day moping about why does the Lord up in the manor, why does he deserve that? He doesn't deserve that. I should have that. Why don't I have this? And why don't I have that? That's
there were periods of that.
Oh, don't get me wrong. I'm saying there weren't periods, but I'm talking about as a general cultural, as a general rule, as a cultural custom and practice. No, people weren't sitting around being driven by envy.
No.
Because at various different, and without being smart, up the top, as you work your way through to the various ranks of, be it lower or upper nobility even, they all understood full well that without the farmer, the blacksmith, the tanner, etc., 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 you starve to death.
Society wouldn't.
Society crumbles.
All
ends of this understood it, and all operated under not just the rule, but the actual leadership and guidance of the king, who was seen as father over the nation, not as this political stooge who gets done up in the suit and tie and smiles on the TV ad and tells you about all the wonderful things he's going to do for you, but then never actually does it. No, he actually cared about how the kingdom and the people were run, because he viewed them as a family. See, all these things we think of as tyrannical, they're not. The concept of a hereditary monarchy was actually to eliminate the kind of politicking and the greasing of palms and the backdoor deals that we've now become accustomed to, and we just think is now completely
You're
normal.
Talking about duty. Once upon a time, our leaders, particularly our politicians, felt a pressing duty
Correct.
to the nation and the people that reside in that nation.
Exactly, and that's where, and I say that as a monarchist, that's when democracy can actually work well. The problem with it is that then you end up getting the scenarios that we have today, which, without being smart, your ancestors knew full well, because that's exactly how the Athenian democracy turned out. It's exactly how the Theban democracy, it's exactly how the democracies of ancient Greece turned out. The irony is that every single person in ancient Greece, from Plato to Herodotus, to anyone else who ever wrote about democracy, all universally said that this didn't work. This didn't work because it ended up just producing sycophants and just basically weasels, rivalries and factionalism and political parties. Go back and read some of the ancient Greeks about what they thought about political parties, and then you wonder why on earth we ever decided to go down the same road. Because it ends up becoming about me getting into a position of power, which again is driven by pride and envy, because the very impetus of, like, especially think about something like the President of the United States, where it's obviously a direct election, right? So you're just directly, it's not like it's appointed by the Senate or by the United States Congress, you're directly electing the executive office, right? So the head of state. It really, and God bless, but it really takes a certain type of person to sit there and go, yeah, I should be the most powerful man in the world.
What was that?
I should be the most powerful man in the world. You know what I mean? Like,
Sure.
oh yeah, no, I deserve to be president.
What an ego.
Like, I deserve to be president. Like, I don't care who you are, no matter what politician, doesn't matter who you like, who you don't like, irrelevant.
That's
like,
today. That's in
no, I'm
today's
talking about today, where it really takes imagine like it takes to sit and go, you know what? I actually should be president. Like, it's a real like it's driven because you're aspiring to it. The king doesn't have to aspire to anything because it's an accident of birth. He doesn't deserve. Does he deserve to be king? No, he doesn't deserve it. But that's the point: is that no one deserves it. No one. He doesn't deserve to be king. So the hope that the nation has is that the king will be raised for it, because that's one of the big differences. Is that even no matter how we think King Charles III is going to turn out, the difference.
You have to think very hard there.
Yeah, true. Is that personal opinions aside, the man has been raised since birth on how to actually
be king.
Rule, how to be a king, because that's how it works.
It raises too many issues. I think Britain, the United Kingdom, well, Britain, England particularly, let's take England. England particularly prospered remarkably when the monarchs were godly.
Correct, 100%. Yep, and the parliaments followed in suit. Because the king kept, for starters, the king, with all due respect to and I like the Westminster system, but with all due respect, the king kept them in check, because there's been no shortage of instances in which the aristocratic parliamentarians have sought to perhaps usurp their station. The Cromwellian dictatorship is
not an easy ride.
example of that. Yeah,
we have to look at history and choose the best example of how things played out.
Yeah.
And the Westminster or the Washminster system,
Washminster system
is definitely the best. If a historian doesn't agree with that comment, I don't know what history they've been reading.
Yeah, exactly. It's
definitely the best system. Look at the European systems, failures in comparison.
Yeah, and the only exactly. It's not. This is not like a. Don't take this as like, Daniel hates democracy at any given level. No, I think democracy can work indeed at local, communal, like, village, town level, where local people. The king doesn't need to tell Katoomba how to run Katoomba, right? Obviously, there's law, and that part is obviously should be adjudicated. But who should be the mayor of this thingo, or what should be our laws for what kind of shops can be the blah blah? No, let the residents of Katoomba decide that. And that was Thomas Aquinas' perspective too, by the way. So Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval theologian and philosopher, he same kind of tripartite view of hierarchy and structure, which is democracy at the lower level, aristocracy at the broadest level, and monarchy at the national.
Interesting.
But without being smart, because that's reflected in the Kingdom of Israel. King David wasn't running around, incessantly dealing with and deciding on the minutiae of what should happen in little old Bethlehem.
Even Moses appointed judges.
That's the point I'm trying to make, and that was the point that was made back in that sermon a couple of weeks ago, however long it was, in the end of chapter 1. Is various levels of governance to be able to adjudicate over those things, and the Westminster system reflects that. That's why, especially in the United Kingdom, it's called the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The House of Commons, the democratic element of the Commons, the commoners, right? The House of Lords, the aristocracy, And who presides over the parliament? The king, right? That's the tripartite system,
It
right?
worked very well once upon a time.
But the unifying principle was what you mentioned earlier, because the commons were godly and they were Christian, right? And they were not envious of those above them. The aristocracy, the House of Lords, were God-fearing and knew their station, so they didn't usurp the king, because they're not the king, they're the aristocrats, and it went wrong when they tried to. That's the whole Cromwellian rebellion, right? You execute Charles I, you institute Cromwell as the Lord Protector, which is a military dictatorship term, and it lasts for all of 5 minutes because you effectively crowned Cromwell anyway, and then we all went, oh, well, this sucks, and you went back to monarchy.
Ironically, he was a godly man, but he made such errors, biblical errors.
Yeah, 100%, yeah, correct.
Is it Oliver Cromwell?
Oliver Cromwell, yeah, mid-16th, broadly speaking, 1649 to 1660 by the time it got done with his successor, which was another Cromwell, his own son. And then they then reinstituted the Westminster system again with the king, some constitutional changes again, brought back, and then now Charles II, and then they had a constitutional revolution in 1688, but no one died in it, called the Bloodless Revolution. Anyway, circling to the point I'm trying to make is that order and hierarchy and leadership, these are things which the Bible talks about quite often, because God has ordered the world hierarchically. Because by definition, all things are under him. Right? He is the only one who is eternal, who is uncreated. And so by definition, everything is then flowing forth from him. That naturally means there is a order, but within that order there is the skeleton of that order is hierarchy.
There's a superstructure.
There's a superstructure, yes. Because there's one who is ultimately at the top, God, uncreated, eternal. Things then must also be hierarchical coming forward from him, because everything else is created as opposed to him being the uncreated one. Right? And so this is why things, well, it's not the only reason, there's 1,000 reasons, but this is one of the fundamental philosophical reasons why things like, not only is communism a bad idea, it also actually doesn't work. So it's a bad idea in and of itself. It's also a bad idea because it's horrifically evil and it's destructive, and we only have a couple of 100 million corpses to testify to that reality over the last 100 years. Because what it does is it destroys the concept of hierarchy. It's anti-realistic. It's trying to fight against reality. And when you do that, all you bring is destruction. You can't do anything. You're never going to get anything good or long-standing when that happens.
You're going to get brutalist architecture in the Eastern Bloc.
Oh, yeah. Yes, because you don't have beauty, because now you're against reality.
There's no beauty.
There's no beauty. You compare the streets of Vienna to the streets of St. Petersburg during the Soviet Union, and the difference is very evident. You go to Vienna, and everything down to the street lights have an essence of beauty to them. That doesn't exist in the Soviet bloc of the 1900s, because such ideology can't actually produce beauty, because it's not in conformity with the order that God has made. It can't produce beauty, and so that's it. It all ties in with each other.
It's a spiritual manifestation of what communism represents.
Yeah, correct. It ultimately represents destruction. It represents death. And the thing that's important for people to understand is that it's the same thing that goes with fascism, or its German variety, Nazism. All of those things are posited initially as great ideas. You read the Communist Manifesto, there's nothing gloomy per se about it, at least in terms of what Marx was profiting as the better solution to the end of capitalism and the progression that we now have to undertake, in his view. It all seems wonderful, from each according to his own to each according to his need. We're going to live communally. People aren't going to rule over each other. There's not going to be violence. We're not going to force our things. We'll live together. And it's obviously much more complex than I'm oversimplifying it. But at the end of the day, you then realise that it's completely against human nature, because Karl Marx's essential view of human beings is that people are fundamentally good. Right? That's Karl Marx's essential fundamental view. People are actually fundamentally good, and will actually work cooperatively and caringly and lovingly toward each other, whereas that's not the case. People can be that, but they're not fundamentally that.
It's a recklessly
It's-
naive worldview at best.
Yeah, at best,
I
yes.
would say criminally naive.
Criminally naive when you take into account the consequences of his ideas that have played out over the last 150 years, yes.
I've read his poetry written when he
So
was a late teenager, early 20s.
Yep.
They were, I'll say, well-meaning odes to Satan, clearly odes to Satan. I think they were well-meaning. I think that was his worldview.
Yeah, well, yeah, essentially, certainly by his early 20s.
A
Yeah.
thoroughly deceived individual.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. A thoroughly deceived individual who never actually, and this is, I know this seems like a trope, but it's actually true in Marx's case, who literally never worked a day in his life, a meaningful job. He was funded by...
And he was angry.
Yeah,
An
angry
young man.
Exactly. He was raised well and wealthy, and is the he's the archetypal case of the wealthy child who comes to spurn the good, everything good that they've had in their life, and therefore goes out and rebels against it.
He was an ingrate.
Complete ingrate.
Ungrateful.
Yeah, ungrateful, and so that ties back to the whole envy and pride thing. Ungratefulness and pride, and so the consequences of that going wrong in one man, the consequences of that has been hundreds of millions of people dead since that point. It's shocking. That's the power of ideas. That's the power of worldview, right? Of how you understand and view the world, and then from that, what you think the world should be. That's really where the consequences come in. Is that the personal tragedy and downfall of one man in terms of ideology and how he views the world and how he views himself and et cetera, et cetera. The consequences of people listening to him has been corpses beyond human reckoning. Yeah, exactly. And devastation, entire civilizational devastation, especially when you talk about the Russians. And that's the consequences of abandoning this. That's all it ultimately is. Same with fascism, it's no different. Fascism, again, is the abandonment of this. Fascism is just Nietzschean will to power worked out fully and implemented in the world. And the consequences of that, again, is the fire and fury that we saw of the Second World War. All right, so the 1920s, 1930s, into the 1940s. And that's the consequences of abandoning this.
The critics will say, oh, but look at all the death and destruction in the Old Testament of the Bible.
Laughable.
Fine, but look at all the destruction when you abandon your attempt to follow God under communism, and then God help you if you're under a communistic system.
The example of that is so easily refutable. So, let's just take the most easily identifiable bad thing to have occurred in the history of Christendom, right? The Spanish Inquisition. Okay, the Spanish Inquisition is fundamentally impossible to justify. And I'm not talking about the Reconquista. So the Reconquista were the Spanish, what we'll call Spanish Christians, Portuguese Christians, retaking back what is today Portugal and Spain, so the Iberian Peninsula, from the Muslim invaders who had conquered them and then ruled them for 700 years by that point. That's the Reconquista, that's something different. The Spanish Inquisition was a series of heresy trials by the Roman Church in Spain, over the course of about 200 years. So it wasn't this one singular event. It was a series of on and off trials and hearings and hence the term Inquisition over the course of about 200 years that put to death, I think, somewhere in the ballpark of about, off memory, 10-ish thousand plus or minus. I'd need to go back and look at the exact numbers. So we're talking maybe, actually I think it's even less than that. I think it's something like 7 to 8, but 7 to 10,000 in the broadest sense anyway. 7 to 10,000 people across 200 years. Even if I just take the raw number of 7,000 or 10,000, that's communism in a slow quarter. Do you know what I mean? Even if you talk about modern atrocities today, like the industry that we've built of abortion, that's a slow Tuesday afternoon in America, where 800,000 babies are killed in America. And that's low because back in the late 80s, early 90s, that number was up at about 1.5 million. And you're going to sit here and, you general person, you're going to sit here and complain about 7,000 people over the course of 200 years versus what fascism does versus what communism does versus what eugenics does, which is just, that's all we're doing today. It's just another modern iteration of eugenics. These people are not worthy to live, babies. We get to decide which human lives are worthy of life and which are not worthy of life. I get to decide, so again, pride, and I'm the arbiter of who lives and dies. That's what that worldview fundamentally is. That's what that idea fundamentally is. I get to the same theological and philosophical premises, the same moral and ethical underpinnings that upheld, antebellum Democrat slavery in the South in America, is the same that upheld the Holocaust, and is the same that upholds the principles of abortion. These are subhumans, they're beneath me, and they don't actually have the full worth and dignity and therefore rights of me, a human being, and so they're not really humans. Not in the personal sense, they have no personhood. They're not persons. That's exactly the view of the African, that's exactly the view of the Jew, but as in of those people back in those respective contexts I mentioned, and we just do the same thing with babies.
That worldview, particularly that element of that worldview which derides this book, the Bible, fails to understand the depravity of the human heart.
Correct.
And if you want to know about the depravity of the
what
human
Karl Marx
heart,
did. Yeah.
Don't go to a $300 an hour psychologist, buy a Bible and read it.
Correct. Read something that's more than 5 minutes old. Yeah. Yes, exactly, because it comes from an understanding of the inclination of human nature, which is unfortunately and sadly and tragically towards wrongdoing. We all know this. Our conscience testifies, like we talked about before we started the study, like our conscience testifies against us. We have all, to use the biblical language, we've all fallen short of the glory of God, right? The moral standard of God. We have all at one point lied. We've all deceived. We've all had anger or hatred towards someone else, even without them perhaps even knowing at times.
Often.
No, I know, but that's my point.
Often people hate their neighbours, and when they meet their neighbours once a week,
yeah, I meant the without knowing.
They
part,
smile
yeah.
at them.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, the without knowing part is what I meant. So we think we're in the clear because you didn't say anything mean to them, but you really wish you had. Yeah, really wish you had. All these kinds of things, right?
Shocking.
And worse yet is that our proclivity is towards grossly and dramatically underselling or undervaluing how severe our violations of God's law actually are. So even that element doesn't help us. And it's only through the Christian worldview and through the rightful biblical understanding of how the world works, and more importantly, in this case, how human nature works, that order, civility, justice, good, and peace have actually been able to come. Because when you've understood that, then you've actually been able to bring order.
Well, especially when our leaders have genuinely tried to implement those things that you just mentioned.
Yeah, correct.
Genuinely tried.
Correct. And it's
not perfectly tried.
No.
Imperfectly tried,
No.
But with a genuine attempt.
But with a genuine attempt. And that's all that can be demanded. You can't expect to have a completely perfect execution of it, because that would be to demand that those human beings be something that they're not. Right? They're human beings and they're going to fail. But are they actually attempting to operate and build society and order society and rule society based upon not what they think should be done, but rather what God says should be done? Not how they think the world should work, but how God says the world is. And that's what we're currently suffering from. Because again, especially when you try to do democracy at a national level, which is what I would argue against doing, when you try to do democracy at a national level, you only end up with exactly what you vote for. Voting is based upon at that national level especially, you're going to get the decisions, the whims, the worldview, the philosophy, the morals, and the ethics of the people. And so the politicians, as much as you can argue against them and should, right, are ultimately a reflection of the people that voted them into power. Right? The current Victorian government is going nowhere anytime soon. They'll be in power for the next 10, 20 years. That's not going to change until Victorians change. Until Melbournians specifically change.
Yep.
Okay? right? Because Victoria is a glorified city-state, right? Yeah, 85% of the people live in one city. And so until that city-state changes, no one should be sitting around confused as to why politics in Victoria will continue to go the way that Victorian politics are currently going. Because all it is just a reflection of the people. Melbourneians have zero desire to oust that current government. They love what they're doing. Even though even remotely sane people around the country can look at it and go...
You would have thought otherwise. The most locked-down city on the planet.
Correct. Yeah, objectively, yeah, correct.
Puts him back into office.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's my point, though. That's my point, yeah. That's my point. So that's what I'm saying to you, but that's putting him back to office. And they had every opportunity, they had an election right afterwards, could have done anything they wanted.
The most locked-down city on the planet.
But that's the full, that's not even tacit, that's the full-blown, wholehearted approval of Melbourneians going, thumbs up.
You can't explain it rationally, logically. You've got to introduce a spiritual element, in my humble opinion.
No, I agree, because that's the abandonment of the Christian worldview.
Spiritual element, then we're cooking with gas.
Correct. But that's my point. Yeah, correct. Yeah, that's my point. That's what happens, is that you can complain all you want in a federalised democracy, but you're getting exactly what you vote for.
Remarkable.
Which is my argument against it, but nonetheless. Once we eventually get on to Deuteronomy chapter 17, whenever we eventually reach that point, where it gives the laws for the kings, that'll be an interesting, a good time to then actually talk about that, because, yeah, we've lost, and I'll finish on this one last sentence, we've, in my opinion, we have lost and are continuing to lose a lot of things, a lot of goodness in our civilization by many things, but by at the political level, our continued progressive abandonment of the right and responsibility and the duty of the monarch, where to the point now we basically are essentially just a crowned republic, and our monarchs are nothing more than a celebrity, basically, and a tourist attraction. And history has proven over and over and over again, even just in the history of Britain, let alone anywhere else, what happens when the barons, be they aristocracy, be they the political class, get unbridled and unfiltered room and scope to be able to run the show, because the king was often the one that kept them in check.
Yeah, especially when they're unprincipled profiteers.
No, it's just corporations.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. It's a corporate oligarchy that's then operating, and 100% correct. Yeah, that's working in and through individuals who are functionally puppets, in the political sense. Is that, and that's being smart. Your ancestors identified this. Democracy always devolves into mob rule, but it's not usually mob rule in isolation. History has consistently testified that democracy, when it devolves into mob rule that is led and directed by oligarchy. Oligarchy being the devolution of aristocracy. Aristocracy, good in a little sense, aristos, meaning the best. So the best people to actually run things, not just those who we think should, but those who are qualified, those who are actually capable of doing things, is aristocracy. And when that devolves, you end up getting a tiny but concerted oligarchy that ends up directing the masses. That's the French Revolution, because the French Revolution is like, oh yeah, the common people rising up. Rubbish. You're all led by the aristocrats who were sick of the king and wanted to get rid of him so that they could run the show. That's the story of Maximilien Robespierre. That's the story of all the different aristocrats.
Arguably, that happened after George Floyd's death in the USA about two and a half years ago.
Yeah, whatever that was. Yeah.
With the burning of major cities.
Yeah, LA, San Francisco. Yeah, exactly.
Gone.
Yeah, correct.
Those are elements that lit the fires, as it were.
Yeah.
They were being directed from on high.
Oh, yeah, and funded. Yeah, they're funded.
Particularly BLM. BLM, if you look at the roots of BLM,
BLM. I'll give the devil his proverbial due. BLM is one of the best ruses I've seen in quite a while. So Black Lives Matter. Yeah, the amount of money, the amount of money that those bandits and
Antifa.
Oh, and Antifa too. Yeah, but exactly, and that's the cultural subversion element. That's the That's the trade. That's the spy game type of cultural and national subversion.
Arguably, it's summarised as communistic, but it's communistic in the sense, not in the Marxist sense, but in the sense of division, subversion,
Correct.
and fueled by vast amounts of money
Correct.
by these very determined oligarchs.
Yeah, correct. Yep,
Very
oligarchs,
determined.
and that's exactly the word. Yep, and you now have where we are functionally living in a really in a kleptocracy. Functionally, we're functionally living in a society that is run by
Vested interests.
vested interest groups, corporate, political, or otherwise, who then direct and influence through, multiple means, but primarily through campaign donations, which once upon a time we just called it bribery. Now we call it. Now we pretend that it's not. We just call it campaign donations, and it doesn't matter whether they're declared or not.
And the old-fashioned patriotism and patrician elements, meaning the care by the leaders for the people whom they're leading.
Exactly, the fatherhood reality.
Gone out the window.
Yeah, exactly, and that was my point about monarchy, is that the whole philosophical premise of the king is as father of the nation, not politician, the smiley guy with the nice hair and the makeup and the filters, that then is trying to convince you as to why he's supposedly a good man and why he supposedly deserves to run things.
Who are dining without masks.
Yeah, who are going,
while the rest of the
exactly.
population is in lockdown and being jailed for not wearing masks.
Exactly, vis-a-vis the commissar of California. Exactly, because the king.
Hypocrisy.
But that's part of it though, because it's but the hypocrisy can't be avoided, because hypocrisy is the point. It's rules for thee and not for me type of quip. You know what I mean? Because that's how it works. The king, however. In the historic sense and in the idealistic sense, the king is born of accident, which means it's not directed by the arbitrary whims of people, but rather it's actually directed by the providence of God. Do you understand?
Alfred the Great would not exit a room first, even though he was king.
Correct.
And by tradition, the king left first. He was always first. Alfred the Great would wait by the doorpost and allow others to pass first.
Yep.
Isn't that amazing?
Yep. Showing respect to them and smiling and talking to them. Yep, exactly.
Unbelievable.
But that's why he's the greatest. He's the greatest Christian king that's ever lived. And so because he is this shining exemplar, and there's plenty of others who are up there as well. He's just, in my view, the greatest. There's also a reason why he's the only British monarch in history to have actually the epithet of the Great, which should tell you something. But yeah, that example can be seen from him because again, it was and he knew that better than anyone else. He was then his grandfather, and then his father. So his grandfather Egbert and his father Aethelwulf had been ruling over Wessex, the most powerful kingdom. Well, at various points, but the most powerful kingdom in England at that point. They've been fighting the Vikings all throughout the 9th century, so the 800s. His father had literally been fighting the Vikings since they arrived there, just before the year 800. In 793, and so long-standing survival, literally, of the kingdom and of his people. His 3 brothers before him had also been king, and they'd ruled for no more than 5 years, because they all died pretty quickly, usually in war. And so he's the 4th and youngest son of Aethelwulf, and he then ascends to the throne because he's the last one left, essentially. So that's an act of providence, because normally, as the 4th son, he was never going to be king. Do you know what I mean? Because if they're not at war, his eldest brother would then just rule, and then his son, the eldest brother's son, would then ascend to the throne. But they all died rapidly, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. They didn't live for long as king. And so the crown then comes to him. That's an act of God's will, not man's decisions, right? And so he knew that better than anyone else. And so then he establishes a dynasty that then completely redefines the history of England. It's the foundation of England. He functionally is the very first king of a unified England. And you get 3 kings, brilliant kings that rule. Him, Alfred the Great, his son, Edward the Elder, or Edward the Confessor, and then the grandson, Athelstan, who all are incredible rulers, righteous men, honourable men, humble men, loyal men, who completely build England as we know it.
Amazing. And God blessed England accordingly.
And God blessed England accordingly because of the righteousness and the faithfulness of those men who were humble. One of the famous stories, and this I definitely will finish on, one of the famous stories is from Alfred's time, is that the Vikings have actually invaded Winchester. They've conquered Winchester, which was the capital seat of Wessex, and long story short, they fought. They all had to retreat out of Winchester, including Alfred. His family gets separated. His wife and children get lost or separated in the fray. He then has to retreat with his royal guard to what's called the Somerset Levels, which was basically marshland, wetlands, to the east. To the west, over on the coast near Bay of Bengal. So he's then living there, hiding out with his royal guard, trying to keep anonymity, so it were, not letting on that he's the king, because often we think about how they don't know he's the king. That happened in ancient times, because this is pre-internet, pre-television, where do you know what I mean? So some people would know, they knew who the king was. They'd never meet him in his life. They wouldn't recognise him if he was standing next to them, because that's just how it's the early medieval period. And so he's living and hiding out here in the Somerset Levels with his royal guard, and he's learning how to bake and learning how to cook, right? And he has this young, we don't know how old she was, but she was young, right? This young servant girl, this young maiden, humble girl, who was teaching him how to make cakes, like little baked goods, and he's burning them. He doesn't know what he's doing, but he's learning. And she is trying to, because she doesn't know he's the king, and so she's teaching him just like any student kind of thing. And she said, no, that's not how you do it. Not literally, but that's the kind of ethos, right? And she's excoriating him for getting it wrong and burning it, and showing him, no, this is the way you have to do it. Now we would think, oh, this medieval king, I bet he said, how dare you talk to the king this way? Don't you know I'm Alfred? No, he humbles himself before this maidservant, right, this maiden, and in humility listens to her, and then respects her and keeps working it and learns from her. Yeah, without burning him.
That's a famous story, isn't it?
Yeah, that's that's Alfred the Great, and there's so many stories like that in Alfred's life, but that's one of the essences of Alfred the Great. But the reason why he's like that, he's a Christian. It's that simple. That's what kings are meant to be. That's what kings can be. We've lost that idea, and so I think it was G.K. Chesterton, the great Christian thinker from the last 100 years, who said that the West will have a return of righteous kings when we become a kingly people. When we actually become a people worthy of, who ourselves have virtue, who have morals, who have a devotion to loyalty and to ethics and to the right and to good. And that will then be reflected, because, like a predecessor, John Calvin, said 500 years ago, when God wants to judge a nation, he gives them wicked rulers. And we're learning that the hard way, especially in democracy, because you vote them into power. So before we keep going on, let's end it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.